afternoon, farmers. I'm Neil with Afternoon Farmer, and today I'm going to be talking about composting. In this video, I'm not going to get to actually showing you making the pile yet. I'm going to keep it short. This is going to be an instructional, educational video about the act of making the compost. And then next video, which I'm actually going to release in just a couple days instead of the normal once a week video, that video is going to be dedicated to showing the making of and turning of the compost pile. I'm doing that in an effort to keep the video short and watchable and approachable. I'm going to flood you with information today. I'm going to give you a couple days to digest it and think about it, and then I'm going to show you the actual steps of me doing it so you can put one with the other and see them. Hopefully it should really set for you and you'll have a good understanding and be able to go out and make your own compost. Now, what exactly is compost? Compost is anything that used to be alive or was generated by something that was alive that has had a chance to go through a process of decay. Through decay or rot, breaking it down into its base components or elements, you release everything that the organism had stored into its cells back into the soil. Making compost is akin to magic. You take this dead, inert, useless material, you wave your hands, you do some mumbo-jumbo. Suddenly, you have this nutrient-dense, rich potting material capable of producing life. So notice I said anything that used to be alive or anything that was produced by something that was alive. Any and all organic compounds can be added to compost. Some things work better than others, and certain ratios of some things work better than others. But in the end, absolutely everything that is alive, was alive, or was produced by something alive can be composted. So, how do we make effective compost? And what is effective compost? What is our goal? As a gardener, all of the lawn clippings that you grow, any tree clippings, any hedges, weeds, all of that can become compost. Now, there are some concerns. Some people recommend against using diseased plants, things with blight or other fungal infections, and that is especially true if you're doing a passive compost system or a lazy composting, as some people have referred to it. I'm getting ahead of myself because lazy composting implies another kind of composting, active composting. And so now we're getting into the different types of compost. And all of this is important to understand to utilize it effectively and to ensure the safety of your plants. You can simply take a pile of organic matter and throw it into a bin or throw it into a pile and build a heap and let it sit for a long period of time, a couple years. And over time, everything in there will have broken down, and you'll notice weeds and other plants start growing on the surface after a while once it's broken down. But that takes years to produce a product that could very feasibly and likely will contaminate anything you use it on with weird funguses and disease, and be ridden with all sorts of seeds that were dormant in the mixture of all the stuff. So clearly that's not the best way to go about doing it. So then, what is the best way to go about making compost? Berkeley has a method, the Berkeley 18-day composting method, where they mix ingredients for compost, greens and browns, which is another digression, because now we have to take a moment to define the greens and the browns that we're mixing. But I'll get to that in just a moment. You combine greens and browns, and it's typically, I've seen it done mostly with just straight lawn clippings. You can use leaves as the browns and even fresh leaves as the greens. Typically, the Berkeley method, as I've seen it, tends to be grass clippings. Just straight grass as the greens, and then dried grass, hay or straw, the like, as the browns, mixed in a 1-to-1 ratio where you moisten the browns every time. Now, I'm saying a lot here, and I get that. With the Berkeley 18-day composting method, you build your compost pile, which we'll get to, and then every 2 days for the 18-day period, you turn your compost pile, which we'll also get to the specifics of how to turn the pile. So, after 18 days, turning the pile 8 times every 2 days, whether it needs it or not, which we'll get to as well, you're left with a pile of mostly finished, almost ready to use compost. It's done cooking. It just needs to rest for about a week or two without turning it anymore, just letting it sit. And then it's ready to use, or you can even break it down further by running it through a sifter and sieve out the good compost and take what's left and use that as a top dressing mulch, or throw it back into another compost pile as fresh browns. And so this Berkeley 18-day composting method is probably the fastest way to make compost, but it is also some of the most work. Normally in my compost piles, I turn them about 4 to 5 times, which is considerably less work than turning it 8 times. And I do it as the pile dictates its need to be turned. And so how do you determine a pile's need to be turned? There's a scientific way where you take a compost thermometer or even a meat thermometer. To use a meat thermometer, you have to peel some of the layers down and get to expose the core, and then put the thermometer in and measure the core temperature. The benefit of the composting thermometer is that it's got about a 2 to 3 foot spike that will record it from the tip. And so you insert that down into the core, and you don't have to peel anything or get your hands into the pile, and you can read the temperature real quick right from there. The temperature is important in the composting pile if you're doing what's called hot composting, which the Berkeley 18-day method is an extreme form of hot composting. So hot composting versus cold composting. Hot composting is much faster, and it breaks things down much more completely in a much shorter time frame, but is an active composting process. You have to physically supply moisture and turn the pile and monitor the temperature, and if it starts dying before you've got things properly baked, you need to add some more organic nitrogen to the mix. But in as little as 18 days, or more likely 5 to 6 weeks is a more realistic approach with the way I do it, you are left with some beautiful, rich, nutrient-dense compost. And you can throw practically anything that you want into this pile. I've thrown entire catfish into the pile. My cat dragged a catfish out of my pond and left it inside in my office, and it was long dead by the time I realized it, and there was no way I was going to eat that. Rather than let it go to waste or throw it away, I put it in the compost bin because it breaks down into nutrients. And after just one turn, there was nothing left recognizable of it. Even the bones, it completely broke down and just became part of the soil. And that's possible because of the hot composting process. It's a bacterial-dominated process compared to a fungally-dominated process, which is what these slow or passive or cold composting methods are, the lazy composting. So it's important to understand all of this before we get into the composting, so you know how you need to structure your pile, how you need to take care of it, and how long to leave it before managing it. And so I mentioned the thermometer briefly. The temperature dictates what I do with my pile. And sometimes I don't even use the thermometer. I mentioned a scientific method and an unscientific method. The scientific method is using the thermometer, and getting an exact temperature and knowing, oh, I need to turn it now because it is under 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the other way, the unscientific method, I was taught it as the ouch method. You peel a layer of the pile, you stick your hand in, and you hold it there for a second, and if it hurts, the pile's still cooking. If you can hold it for about 5 seconds before it starts to hurt, it's about time to flip it. If you put it as, ow, you don't need to turn it. It's still cooking. There's still plenty. It's not anaerobic, at least not on the outside levels where it's at. At the very center in the core, it may have gone anaerobic by now, but you can tell by the heat there that it still is actively working. That's not very scientific, though, because even 120 can hurt you if you're sensitive to temperature and if you hold it for a while. And that's why I said if it takes 5 seconds for it to start hurting, or for you to feel like you need to pull your hand away, then it's probably time to turn the pile. And if you recently turned the pile and it's like that, then it means your pile's probably just about done and you need to just let it sit. When you turn your pile, you're doing several things. You are randomizing and dispersing the nutrients throughout the pile to make it a more uniform, homogeneous mixture. So when you build the pile, you build it in layers like a lasagna to make sure you have the right mixture of the ingredients. And so it's not a very homogeneous mixture, and it won't be great compost if you never turn it. In fact, it won't become proper compost if you don't turn it. It'll become straw and eventually break down and eventually become an anaerobic sludge in the center as it gets some moisture in there and it breaks down in the core. But it's not going to be compost. So you need to turn the pile to get it more homogeneous and uniformly mixed so it has a good balance of nutrients in it. You also need to turn it because a compost pile has 2 sections. There's the core and the shell. The shell is going to sit about 6 inches to 8 inches all the way around it, and it insulates and protects the core. It itself is not going to compost. You can stick your hand through about 6 inches of it, and after a day or so, it's dry and hay-like, if you start with grass clippings, and not composted. You could see, if you had grass seeds in there, you could see the entire seeds unchanged. And so if you don't turn it properly, you'll end up with those seeds ending up in the final product, and they will germinate. The goal of turning the compost pile is to pick up the shell from the outside and move it to the side, and make that shell become the new core. And you do it layer by layer, building up that new core, and you have to provide moisture to each layer as you do. Because if you don't, it's going to be very dry on the inside, and it takes moisture to drive the decomposition process. All of the bacteria in the center of the pile needs the moisture to survive and thrive. When the pile gets dry, the composting process is going to stop, and all of the nitrogen that is in the cell walls in the form of the chlorophyll and everything else in there is just going to evaporate into the atmosphere. It's not going to be sequestered into the carbon. Ultimately, that's what we're doing with compost. We are sequestering or storing all of the nutrients that we can from the plant matter or the animal matter or whatever we throw into it, the manure, the hair clippings, the nail clippings, whatever we throw into it, it all breaks down, and we try and sequester those minerals and those nutrients into the carbon that is the browns. Think of an activated charcoal filter. Those are lumps of carbon that absorb things that pass through it. Any water that has stuff in it, the carbon sucks that stuff into it and stores it in its complex crystalline structure, filling all of its gaps with this stuff, these minerals. And so that's what these carbons do in this pile. They store the soluble forms of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, any of the even the micronutrients all get broken down. Anything that the plants that you put into the compost pile or the manure that is in the compost pile has absorbed, it all is released as the water passes through it, and as the bacteria eats it and break down and die, release it as their own feces or waste products. All of that gets absorbed into the carbon and stored there. And then later, when the cell structures break down and collapse, you're left with what amounts to soil that is very nutrient dense because of all of the stuff that is sat and absorbed. And so if you don't provide the moisture to facilitate that reaction, what you're going to end up with is a dry, nutrient void carbon substance that's going to leach whatever nutrients you put in and take a while to break down further. So you have to provide this moisture as you're turning the pile. And you also, as you turn it, you lift it up from this clump that it formed into and spread it out, and so it gets exposed to oxygen. And it needs both of those things. I mentioned anaerobic sludge earlier. That's what happens if your pile can't get oxygen anymore. If the shell forms and the pile in the middle just kind of begins to ferment, there's too much moisture and not enough airflow, it's just a solid clump, it'll rot and it'll stink, and it's slimy and sticky and sludge. That happens from having too much moisture and too much nitrogen content without enough carbon to absorb it. And so it's all a balancing act, and it takes some experience and some playing around. Once you get it, it's easy. The goal here, when I turn the pile and I introduce the extra moisture and oxygen and feed the bacteria that is already in the pile here, the thermophiles, and that's what the bacteria that love the higher temperatures are called, thermophiles. So I'm going to feed and water them. The pile will cool some as I turn it. That's to be expected. But within a day, it should be back hotter than it is now. The graph for heat starts kind of like this. This is where you're starting to turn because it's lowered. And so you turn it and it goes, whoa, here's the temperature. And then over the next couple days, it's going to slowly go down. And once it's about here, right below the 135, we need to turn it and add moisture again to get it to go, whoa. And then it'll, come down. And so the goal is to manage the waves. We don't want the temperature to drop well below 130, or the whole process will slow down. The thermophiles will die out and take a while to reform when I turn it next time. And a lot of the nitrogen will have been released into the air and not captured properly because of my mismanaging of the pile. Right when it gets to 130, it's time to turn the pile, and that should spike the temperature to about 150 to 155. If we hit 160, that means we have too much nitrogen in the pile and not enough carbon. And so you can't exactly take nitrogen out of the pile, so you have to add some more browns to the pile, or just let it cook off some of its extra nitrogen and acknowledge that you're going to lose some of that to the atmosphere, but that you had too much in the first place, and so whatever you planted in would have been burned. And so you let it do its thing and burn out, or preferably to utilize it and capture it, you add the carbons in, your pile grows now, you've slowed it down a little because these new carbons are going to take a while to break down properly. And so anytime you add material to your pile, you're essentially extending the end date that everything will be ready. Now, if you add good browns without any seeds, you don't have to wait for it to fully break down. Whatever's left in there will just become worm food or mulch. But if you're using grass clippings as browns and there's any grass seeds in there, you need to allow that to fully bake through. And so that involves multiple days that that section reaches the 150-degree mark. Because over that temperature, any of the pathogens like blight or other fungus, fruit that mysteriously rotted. I mentioned earlier, people say you shouldn't compost that stuff, and that's true for a passive or a lazy or a cold compost system, because those don't reach the temperatures necessary to bake off those pathogens, and so those fungus will dominate the pile, and anything that you use that soil on will spread it, and anything susceptible to that blight will take it. And so if you had blight in your tomatoes and you cold compost it, and the next year you plant tomatoes with that compost, every single one of your tomatoes is going to be inoculated with blight fungus at its birth. So unless it just has a natural immunity to it, there are some extremely blight-resistant hybrids out there, but even they might succumb to it because they're inoculated from birth whenever they're weak. And so it's not good for your soil at that point to use this fungally dominated compost that had questionable material put in initially. And so if you're doing a lazy composting system, do not compost things like grass clippings with weed seeds in it. Weed seeds in general. If you have weeds that go to seed, these aren't weeds, but this is a zinnia that's right next to me that has gone to seed. And if I were to throw this into a fungally dominated or a cold or a passive composting system, I would get zinnias that pop up everywhere I use that compost, which may not be a bad thing, but they can get invasive if you let them. And so you don't want to put things like spent flower heads that have gone to seed and things that have rotted away into those fungally dominated cold composting systems. But it's fine to put them into a hot composting system that you're properly tending, because the bacteria will cook the fungus. The fungus cannot survive at the 150 degrees. The spores cannot survive. The grass seeds will not survive if you cook them at the 150 degrees for 3 days. So that's when it comes to turning the pile. You have to, with a pitchfork, scoop off the shell and make that become the new core and moisten it as you do. And then you take the old core and you arrange it all over the old shell that is now the new core, and you make the old core become the new shell to insulate that. So you cook one section, and then you flip it and reverse it, and you cook the next section, and then you just keep alternating and doing that. I turn mine typically 4 to 5 times. Once a week for my first flip. After a week, it'll be about 5 days because there's less nitrogen available, and so it cooks out a lot faster and drops temperature. And so I flip it, and it finds new sources as you make new contacts with everything, and you randomize the pile. And so the pile will get hot again, but it gets hot for less time. It'll hit the 150 for about 5 days after the first turn, but it takes about a day to build up. And then it drops below the 150, and then into the 140s, and then into the 130s. And that's when I like to flip it the first time, is when it's down in the low 130s. And it'll spike up, and the new core should hit the same around 150, 155 if your ratio is right. But like I said, it lasts a little less long after the flip, and then less long the next time. So next time it might only be in the 150s for 3 days, maybe even 2. Eventually you'll flip it one day, and you'll go out and measure it the next day, and it won't even be above 130. And that's when you know you have cooked it as effectively as you're going to cook it. If you flip it anymore, it's not going to get over 130 again. And so you stop flipping it, and you just let it sit for 2 weeks to cure or finish off or rest, are the words I've heard attributed to it. And after 2 weeks of resting, that compost is pristine and ready. Earlier I mentioned the greens versus the browns. This is the paper from a yard waste bag, which they are compostable and they are browns. It's just carbon. It's essentially a little bit of wood as a pulp product, and it's completely compostable. And this is just some leaf matter, some greens, rich in chlorophyll and nitrogen. Now, when I say greens and browns, in this case, it actually matches those colors, sure. It doesn't have to. The greens is a description of its nitrogen content. Anything that is rich in nitrogen is considered a green. Coffee grounds, while brown in color, are nitrogen rich and are considered a green. Horse manure, while brown in color usually, is rich in nitrogen and so is considered a green. And so if you made a composting pile where you were mixing greens with all these leaf matter and you had some brown horse manure that you thought were browns and you mixed them together, well, all you've really done is mixed nitrogen and nitrogen, and you're going to have an extremely hot and extremely stinky pile. And it's not just stinky because of the manure, because you can add manure to a regular pile and it won't stink if you've done your ratios properly. The bacteria will eat the manure and break it down and sequester it into the carbon. It'll have a slight aroma right up on the pile and as you turn it, but it's not going to reek and it's not going to make your house smell bad having the pile around. But if you mix the greens and the greens, the manure with fresh lawn clippings, oh, that's going to reek. It's going to not just smell like the manure, it's going to get an ammonia smell. It's going to smell like an army of cats has suddenly peed on your compost pile. And that's how you know you've added too much nitrogen, and it's time to balance it by mixing browns. You can either scoop up leaf litter from a forest floor, or rake up your leaves if you got them, or cut your grass and spread the clippings on a tarp and leave them in the sun for 3 or 4 days, and let it bake out all of the nitrogen, and you're left with browns, a nice carbon material to work as your substrate. And so the color is more of a mental construct than a physical construct that generally resembles the truth. But you can't just go by the color to determine what it is. You have to actually either research or think about what the item is to know for sure what the right ratios are. Now, if you use a wide variety of materials, greens and browns and whatever you have, all sorts of leaves and plants and whole things, just have a huge variety of material, you'll get the right greens and browns. Because you'll have some stuff that's stemmy and woody as a shrub, and leaves and sticks and twigs and everything. But if you're just going with lawn clippings, you have to be more careful and manage your ratio. And all of this is just a little extra nuances and details, and it might be too much information. I don't want you drinking from the fire hose, so to speak, but it's a complex topic and has a lot of terms and a lot of ideology behind why we do what we do. And once you understand that, it lets you know, oh, I would like to build a hot compost pile, and here's how I need to do that, so that I have all of the compost available that I will need for my planting. Since it takes about 6 weeks from start to finish with the compost, plus a couple extra weeks to finish up and rest afterwards, you're looking at 2 months from when you start it to when you finish it. So really, you need to be making compost now that you plan on using 2 months from now. And so you need to have made compost 2 months ago that you're planning to use today. Well, obviously we don't have a time machine. We can't go back in time. What can we do if we need compost today? Well, you can buy it. That gets extremely expensive. I spent $360 on 1 truckload of compost that filled 2 raised beds, and I used it in an afternoon. It's produced an abundance of vegetables since then, but still, that's not sustainable. I cannot afford to keep buying truckload after truckload of compost. So I realized I had to get started making my own compost. And that's what led me down this path. And I'm hoping to be able to streamline the process. I've watched probably 40 or 50 hours of various instructional videos on making compost, and am synthesizing what works out of all of those and what I've done and my process now, and getting it down to an approachable format that I can share with other people. Well, farmers, I hope you enjoyed Composting 101 as I give you the basic insights and just teach you some of the basics of composting, some of the terminology you'll need to know, and a summary of the processes. Join me on Wednesday at noon, and I'll actually show you making the compost pile and turning it, and give you a little bit more information along the process. Until then, enjoy your garden, stay safe from the sun, and good afternoon.